I remember standing there in that little bookstore, clutching a copy of my novel like it was a lifeline. The tables had been set, the chairs neatly arranged, and a small stack of my books sat under a banner with my name on it. I had pictured this day so many times, imagining the warmth of familiar faces, the proud smiles of my children, maybe even a photo of me signing my first book surrounded by family. But instead, I found myself in a room full of strangers who weren't there for me at all. They had drifted in for the free wine, asking if I knew where the bathroom was, barely even glancing at the covers on display. The emptiness was louder than any crowd. Every empty chair felt like a rejection. My children had promised me they would be there, but they had chosen something else, someone else, over me. It wasn't just disappointment, it was humiliation. I had worked for years on this book, quietly pouring my heart into every page, believing it was finally my turn to be seen. But on the day that should have been a celebration, I was invisible again. I tried to keep my composure. I smiled when people passed by. I answered questions about large print and bookmarks. I even signed a few copies for people who had no idea who I was. But inside, I felt smaller and smaller with each passing minute. It was as though all those years of sacrifice, all the times I had shown up for everyone else, had been erased in one careless decision to skip my book launch for something more convenient. When I packed up that afternoon, loading the boxes of unsold books into my car, the weight of them felt unbearable. Not because of the paper and ink, but because of what they represented: years of effort, love, and hope left unnoticed. Driving home, I replayed every moment, every excuse, every dismissal I had endured, and I realized that this was more than just a disappointing afternoon. This was the breaking point. That day, in that nearly empty bookstore, I came to a painful but necessary decision. I was done being the background character in my own life. I was done waiting to be noticed. Done sacrificing myself for people who couldn't even bother to show up. For the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me. I didn't know yet what I would do. But I knew one thing for certain: I would never let myself be invisible again. I spent more than 3 decades in a classroom, shaping the lives of other people's children. Teaching wasn't just a job for me, it was my identity, my calling. Every day I stood in front of students who needed encouragement, guidance, and sometimes just someone to believe in them. And while I poured myself into their futures, I was also carrying the heavy weight of raising 2 children on my own. When their father walked away, I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. I worked double shifts, grading papers at midnight, tutoring on weekends, and taking on summer jobs just to keep us afloat. I made sure tuition was paid, not just for their schooling, but later for their college years too. I remember writing checks I could barely afford, reminding myself that every sacrifice was an investment in their dreams. It wasn't only about education. When the time came for weddings, I was there with the down payments, the deposits, the extra support that smoothed the way. Later, when they wanted homes of their own, I dipped into savings again, giving what I had worked decades to build, and when the grandchildren arrived, I stepped in without hesitation. Babysitting became a regular rhythm, hours upon hours every week. Not because I had to, but because I believed that's what family did for one another. Through it all, I never asked for much in return. A thank you here and there, a hug, a birthday card, a phone call that wasn't rushed. Those small gestures would have been enough to remind me that my efforts mattered. But somewhere along the way, my steady giving became an expectation. My presence was assumed, my sacrifices invisible. My son married a woman who found comfort in her own mother's arms, treating me as though I were a footnote in her husband's story. My daughter, kind but easily swayed, often followed her brother's lead, keeping the peace by keeping me at a distance. And so I slipped quietly into the background, the reliable figure who showed up but rarely shined. Looking back, it wasn't one grand betrayal that stung the most. It was the slow erosion of acknowledgement. The way my love and effort were taken for granted year after year. That's why the empty bookstore cut so deeply. It wasn't just about one afternoon. It was the culmination of a lifetime of being overlooked, of giving everything while receiving so little in return. By the time I left that event, the weariness I carried wasn't just physical. It was the exhaustion of a heart that had been stretched thin for too long. And deep inside, something began to shift. That evening, when I walked into my house, it felt heavier than usual. The silence clung to the walls, and as I set down the boxes of unsold books, I couldn't help but glance at the mantel where family photos lined the shelf. In every picture, I was there but always in the background. At my son's graduation, I stood slightly behind his new in-laws. At my daughter's wedding, I was cropped to the edge of the frame. Holidays, birthdays, family gatherings time and again. I was present, but never central. Always the support, never the one supported. I poured a glass of wine and sat down at the kitchen table, staring at those memories with fresh eyes. For years, I had told myself it was enough to simply be there. But that day in the bookstore had stripped away every illusion. I had been invisible, not just for one afternoon, but for decades. Almost without thinking, I reached for a pad of paper and began to write. At first, it was small things: Marcus's college tuition, Rachel's tuition. Then came the wedding contributions, the down payments, the countless emergency loans that were never paid back. And then, the babysitting hours upon hours I had given freely, enough to add up to years of my life. Line by line, the list grew longer, the numbers rising higher until I sat staring at a total that made my chest tighten. Nearly $200,000. $200,000. That was what I had given in hard money alone, not even counting the sleepless nights, the missed opportunities, or the years of my life spent putting myself second. And in return, excuses, dismissals, a spa day chosen over my book launch. As I looked at the final figure, something inside me shifted. The sorrow was still there, but it was no longer crushing me, it was fueling me. That list was not just a record of sacrifices. It was proof of how much I had been taken for granted. Proof that I had value, even if the people closest to me refused to see it. For the first time in years, I felt clarity. I would no longer be their safety net, their afterthought, their invisible servant. I was ready to reclaim my life, my choices, and my worth. That night, I made myself a quiet vow: the next chapter of my life would not be written in the shadows. And as I folded that piece of paper and tucked it into my drawer, I knew exactly what my next step would be. Monday morning arrived with a sharpness that felt almost cleansing. For the first time in years, I woke up with a sense of direction that wasn't about someone else's needs or schedules. It was about my own choices. I put on my best black suit, the one that made me feel powerful, and I stepped out the door, determined to reclaim my life. At 9 o'clock sharp, I sat in my lawyer's office. The room smelled of oak and coffee, just as it had the last time I was here years ago. But I was not the same woman. Back then, I was a mother desperately trying to survive a divorce. Now, I was a woman who had finally seen the truth. I handed him my neatly written notes and explained what I wanted. My will would no longer split everything equally between Marcus and Rachel. They would each receive a small sum enough to be generous, but not enough to buy their loyalty. Instead, I redirected the heart of my estate into something more meaningful. My grandchildren would each have an educational trust, $75,000 apiece, set aside for them to pursue their schooling. But there would be conditions, not forced visits or hollow gestures, but genuine effort to maintain a relationship with me. Letters, phone calls, showing up in ways that mattered. If they chose not to, that money would go to literacy programs instead. I wanted them to learn that relationships are worth more than a check. By mid-morning, I was at the bank. Marble floors, polished counters, and the quiet confidence of a place built to protect wealth. I spoke with the trust officer, carefully outlining how I wanted everything structured. It felt strange, almost surreal, to speak so plainly about money when I had spent my whole life quietly giving it away. But for once, I wasn't being used. I was setting terms. Later that afternoon, I met with my financial advisor. I instructed him to begin transferring yearly gifts to my sister Margaret, the one person who had stood by me without condition. And beyond that, I directed sizable donations to the library, the animal shelter, and the food bank, places that represented the values I lived by, not the entitlement I had raised. Each signature, each initial on the stack of documents, felt like lifting a weight off my chest. I wasn't doing this out of spite. I wasn't seeking revenge in the bitter sense. This was justice, not dramatic, not loud, but precise and deliberate. By the time I returned home, I felt lighter than I had in years. For once, I wasn't invisible. I was steering the course of my own life. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before my children realized just how much had changed. I thought I had seen the worst of the disappointment, the humiliation, the betrayal, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. It started with a phone call from my son, his voice shaky, almost frantic. He told me they had found something, in an old safety deposit box key from my late ex-husband. At first, I assumed it was nothing. He hadn't exactly left us much when he walked away, and after all these years, I had stopped expecting anything from him. But when I arrived at my son's house and saw the manila envelope with my name on it, my hands began to tremble. Inside were investment statements, insurance policies, and a letter written in my ex-husband's familiar handwriting, dated just months before his death. I sat down, my heart pounding, and began to read. In the letter, he admitted everything I had known, but never heard him say aloud, that he had failed me as a husband and failed his children as a father. He confessed that he had abandoned us when we needed him most. And then he wrote something that pierced me to the core. He had always admired my strength, my sacrifice, and my selflessness, even if he had been too proud to acknowledge it. The investments he had hidden away amounted to $84,000, nearly $1 million, untouched, waiting. But he didn't leave it to our children outright. Instead, he left it to me, with instructions that it should only be passed on if they learned to show the kind of consistent love and respect that I had given them all their lives. I sat there with tears streaming down my face, caught between grief and vindication, anger at the years he left me to struggle alone. sorrow that his recognition came far too late to ease the loneliness of those long nights, but also an unexpected satisfaction, because even in death, he had validated everything I had been feeling. He had seen me. He had understood. And suddenly, I realized something staggering. The power I thought I had reclaimed with my own will and financial decisions was now doubled. Not only was I in control of my own resources, but I was also the gatekeeper to nearly 1 million more. My children, who had dismissed me so easily, would soon discover that their future security rested entirely in my hands. As I folded the letter and placed it back into the envelope, I knew the storm was coming. My family would not take this lightly. They would fight. They would accuse. They would beg. But for once, I would be standing on solid ground with proof in writing that I was not invisible after all. The day after the discovery, my front door became a revolving stage for accusations. My children arrived in a tight pack, their faces flushed with anger and fear. It wasn't the kind of concern a child has for their parents' well-being. No, this was the panic of people who realized the ground beneath them had shifted. They came at me with raised voices, each one sharper than the last. They told me I was being cruel, that I was manipulative, that I was letting bitterness drive me to punish my own family. They threw words like selfish and unfair at me, as if decades of sacrifice could be erased with their sudden outrage. I listened without flinching. For years, I would have folded under their disappointment, desperate to keep peace, desperate to be needed. But that woman no longer lived here. I stood calmly, letting their fury roll over me, and when they finally paused long enough to demand an explanation, I gave them the only one that mattered. I told them I wasn't angry. I was awake. The words hung in the air like a stone dropped into water. They didn't know how to answer. For the first time, they were forced to see me not as their endless resource, but as a woman with her own will, her own clarity. Their voices rose again, desperate now, tinged with fear. They warned me that I was breaking the family apart, that I was choosing outsiders and institutions over blood. But all I could think was how many years I had spent being present for them while they treated me like background noise. If blood was all that mattered, they had forgotten what it meant long before I did. The confrontation spilled out onto the porch. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, their curiosity drawn by the shouting. My children didn't notice. They were too consumed by the idea of losing what they thought was guaranteed. I remained steady. I told them I had made my decisions with a clear mind and a clear heart. I reminded them that respect and love are not automatic rewards, they must be earned. Even within a family, their protests grew weaker, their anger giving way to disbelief, and in the silence that followed, I turned and walked back inside. I left them standing on my porch, stunned into silence. For once, the noise wasn't mine to carry. And though I knew this battle was far from over, I felt the power of holding my ground. There comes a moment when silence can no longer protect you, when truth, no matter how devastating, must be spoken. That moment arrived as I sat across from my children, their faces still burning with the sting of confrontation. I took a breath that felt heavier than any before and told them what I had carried alone for months. I had cancer, stage 3 pancreatic cancer. The words seemed to drain the air from the room. They stared at me, their anger dissolving into confusion, disbelief, and fear. But for me, there was no disbelief left. I had been living with this knowledge for 3 months. I had endured the tests, the chemotherapy that left me weak and hollow, and I had made the decision to stop treatment. I didn't want to spend what time I had left tethered to hospital chairs and poisoned by chemicals. I wanted to live, even if living meant less time. The truth was, my book launch was never just about a dream fulfilled. It was my farewell. The legacy I wanted to leave behind, a story of finding a voice after a lifetime of silence. I had hoped my children would be there, not because of the book itself, but because I wanted them with me for my final chapter. Instead, they chose a spa day. As I said this, tears threatened to fall, but I held them back, not out of strength, but out of exhaustion. I was too tired to keep begging for love, too tired to explain what should have been obvious all along. I asked them the question that had haunted me every night since the diagnosis. If their sudden attention only existed because I was dying, was it really love, or was it just guilt wearing the mask of devotion? The silence that followed was unbearable. My daughter wept quietly. My sons stared at the floor. Their spouses shifted uncomfortably. None of them seemed to have an answer, because the answer was too painful to admit. For years, they had overlooked me. Now, faced with the reality of losing me, they wanted to rush in as though love could be rebuilt in borrowed time. But love isn't about panic. It isn't about last-minute apologies. Love shows up before the crisis. Love pays attention before it's too late. I left the question hanging between us, not to wound them, but because it was the truth. And for once, I wasn't going to protect them from it. The room was heavy with silence, the kind that makes even breathing feel like breaking glass. And in that silence, I wondered if this was the last lesson I would ever teach them. When I walked into the oncologist's office for my latest scans, I braced myself for the worst. I had already made peace with the idea that my time was short. I had planned, prepared, even said my quiet goodbyes. But nothing could have prepared me for what the doctor said that morning. The tumor had shrunk by 60%. I sat there in stunned silence, clutching the paper in my hands as if the words might dissolve if I let go. The doctor explained it was extraordinary, practically unheard of at my stage. With continued treatment and changes in lifestyle, I could have years ahead of me, not months. For the first time in months, I felt air rush back into my lungs, but it wasn't pure relief. Alongside joy was something heavier doubt. I thought about the weeks since my confession. My children had been showing up, bringing meals, taking me to appointments, making space in their busy lives that had once excluded me. It felt good comforting, even. But a question lingered, like a shadow. Were they here because they loved me, or because they thought they were losing me? That afternoon, I sat with my grandchildren at the kitchen table. They spread crayons and construction paper across the surface, determined to make me get well cards. Their chatter filled the room with a kind of joy no medicine could ever match. At one point, my eldest granddaughter looked up at me with those wise eyes children sometimes have and said, "Grandma, even if you weren't sick, we'd still love you, because you're our grandma." Her words sank deeper than any diagnosis or prognosis ever could. In their innocence, there was no guilt, no performance, no condition, just love, pure, uncomplicated love. For the first time, I let myself believe that maybe things could change. Maybe my family could learn to see me not as their safety net, not as the woman they turned to when they needed something, but as someone worth knowing, worth cherishing. While I was still here, hope bloomed cautiously inside me. It wasn't loud or triumphant, it was fragile, like the first flower pushing through the cracks after a long winter. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I had been given something rare more time, and with it, the chance to finally see whether my family's love was real. Not long after the news of my unexpected remission, my family gathered around my dining table for a quiet dinner. It wasn't extravagant, just home-cooked food, laughter, and the hum of conversation. Yet it felt different. This time, they asked about me not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest. My son remembered that my favorite color was purple. My daughter suggested the little Greek restaurant downtown, the one I had loved for years, but rarely visited. They even asked about my writing class, listening with curiosity instead of polite dismissal. For the first time in decades, I felt truly seen. As I watched them, I knew the conditions I had placed in my will would remain, not as punishment, but as protection. I wanted my grandchildren to grow up knowing that love isn't about inheritance or expectation. It's about presence, effort, and care. If they wanted to keep me in their lives, it had to be real. And yet, something inside me softened that evening. Because even though the wounds ran deep, the change in their eyes felt genuine. Maybe it took the fear of losing me to wake them up. Maybe it took my own awakening to force the shift. Either way, I realized the miracle wasn't just in the medical scans. The true miracle was finally being acknowledged not as the invisible support system, but as a person worthy of love. As I cleared the table that night, I thought about all of you who might be listening. Maybe you felt invisible in your own family. Maybe you've poured your heart into others and wondered if anyone truly saw you. If so, let my story remind you of this family isn't defined by blood alone. Family is defined by behavior, by respect, and by love freely given. Sometimes, the hardest decision is learning to stop being invisible. Sometimes, the greatest miracle isn't survival, it's finally being seen. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, I'd love for you to share your own experiences in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps this community of stories grow. And maybe, just maybe, your voice will be the one that helps someone else feel a little less invisible.